In the darkest hour of Israel's history, when kings bowed to false gods and the land cried out for righteousness, the Almighty raised up a man of fire, Elijah the Tishbite, a name that would shake palaces and split heavens. This is the story of the prophet who commanded drought, called down fire from heaven, and walked so closely with God that death could not touch him. From confronting wicked kings to raising the dead, from fleeing in despair to hearing God's gentle whisper. Witness the extraordinary journey of the man who never tasted death, taken up alive in a chariot of fire. His story will ignite your faith and remind you that God still speaks to those who dare to listen. Are you ready to walk with fire? In the northern kingdom of Israel, King Ahab sat on his throne, but his heart was already lost to evil. The turning point came when he decided to marry Jezebel, daughter of Baal, king of the Sidonians. This wasn't just a political alliance. It was spiritual suicide for an entire nation. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 31 captures the gravity of this moment. And it came to pass, as if it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took as wife Jezebel, the daughter of Baal, king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. The scripture says it was as if following Jeroboam's sins was trivial to Ahab, not enough rebellion for his taste. He wanted to go further, deeper into darkness. Jezebel brought with her the worship of Baal, a Canaanite fertility god that her people believed controlled the rain, storms, and harvest. For a farming nation like Israel, this was appealing. Why trust an invisible God when you could worship one who supposedly guaranteed your crops? Ahab didn't just tolerate his wife's religion, he embraced it completely, abandoning the God of his fathers. This foreign princess had accomplished what no enemy army could do. She had conquered Israel's king from within his own palace. What began in the royal bedroom quickly infected the entire kingdom like a deadly plague. Ahab wasn't content to worship Baal privately in some hidden corner of his palace. He made it the official religion of Israel. 1 Kings 16:32 records his brazen actions. Then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. He constructed a complete temple for this false god right in Israel's capital city, where everyone could see it. This wasn't done in secret or shame. It was done with pride and ceremony. But Ahab's rebellion went even deeper into darkness. Verse 33 continues, "And Ahab made a wooden image." Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. The wooden image was an Asherah pole, representing Baal's supposed female partner. These were symbols of fertility worship that involved the most degrading and immoral practices imaginable. Think about what the scripture is saying here. Ahab was worse than every single wicked king before him combined. That's quite a statement when you consider Israel's long history of bad rulers. The people, seeing their king's bold example and fearing his power, followed eagerly into this new religion. After all, if the king said Baal was powerful and could bless them, who were they to argue? The worship of the true God became a distant memory as altars to Baal sprouted throughout the land like weeds after rain. But God wasn't finished with Israel, and he certainly wasn't going to let Baal's false claims go unchallenged. In the wild, rugged region of Gilead, beyond the Jordan River, lived a man whose very name declared his unwavering loyalty to the true God. Elijah the Tishbite, his name meaning "My God is the Lord," was about to become God's chosen answer to Israel's spiritual rebellion. The Bible doesn't tell us about Elijah's family background, his formal education, or even how he first became a prophet. What we do know is that God had been preparing him for this exact moment in Israel's history. Elijah wasn't from the sophisticated cities of Jerusalem or Samaria. He had no connections to the royal court or the established religious system that had become so corrupt. He was a simple man from the countryside, probably wearing rough, homespun clothes and living a hard, simple life in the wilderness regions. His hands were likely calloused from outdoor work, his skin weathered by sun and wind. But God often chooses the most unlikely people for his greatest works. Moses had been a fugitive shepherd when God called him. David was just a teenage shepherd boy when Samuel anointed him. And now Elijah, a country prophet from the remote hills of Gilead, would stand fearlessly against the most powerful and wicked king and queen in Israel's entire history. His calling wasn't announced with royal fanfare or religious ceremony. It would be proven through his bold, unwavering obedience to God's word. Without any advance warning, without requesting a formal royal audience, or following the elaborate court protocols, Elijah suddenly appeared before King Ahab in his palace. Can you imagine the scene? This wild-looking prophet from the wilderness, probably still dusty from his journey, suddenly standing before Israel's most powerful king with a message that would shake the entire nation to its foundations. The court officials must have been shocked at this breach of protocol. 1 Kings 17:1 captures this absolutely dramatic confrontation, and Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word." Notice carefully how Elijah began his pronouncement, "As the Lord God of Israel lives." He was making it crystal clear which God he served, boldly distinguishing the true, living God of Israel from the dead, powerless idol called Baal. Then came the shocking, earth-shaking announcement that would change everything. No rain or even morning dew would fall on Israel, except when Elijah himself commanded it to come. This was a direct, unmistakable challenge to Baal's supposed power over weather and fertility. If Baal really controlled the rains and storms, as his worshippers claimed, then let him prove it by bringing rain despite God's judgment. Elijah was essentially declaring spiritual war on the false god through this drought. The prophet stood absolutely fearlessly before the most powerful and dangerous man in the kingdom and told him plainly that his God was completely powerless, and his nation would suffer until they returned to the one true God. After delivering such a bold and threatening message to the king, Elijah needed to disappear immediately and completely. Ahab, and especially the vengeful Queen Jezebel, would certainly want him captured and executed for what he had proclaimed against their kingdom and their God. But God had already prepared the next step in his perfect plan. 1 Kings 17:2-3 reveals God's specific instructions to his faithful servant. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Get away from here and turn eastward and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan." God told Elijah to travel east, back toward his familiar homeland of Gilead, to a small remote stream called Cherith. This brook flowed into the mighty Jordan River, providing a perfectly hidden refuge, far from the king's searching soldiers and spies. The location was ideal, remote enough to be safe, yet with fresh water for drinking. God wasn't just protecting Elijah from human enemies who wanted to kill him. He was strategically positioning his prophet for the next important phase of his unfolding plan. The brook Cherith would become Elijah's private sanctuary, a peaceful place where he could wait patiently and watch as God's righteous judgment began to unfold across the rebellious land of Israel. Here, away from all the chaos, danger, and corruption of the royal court, God would care for his faithful servant in the most miraculous and unexpected way imaginable. At the secluded brook Cherith, God revealed his provision plan to Elijah, and it was unlike anything anyone had ever heard before in all of human history. 1 Kings 17:4 records God's amazing promise, "And it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." Ravens, of all the creatures in God's creation that he could have chosen as Elijah's food service, he deliberately picked these large black scavenger birds that were considered ceremonially unclean according to strict Jewish law. These weren't gentle doves or majestic eagles. They were ravens, birds that normally fed on dead animals and garbage. Yet God commanded them to serve his prophet with the dedication of royal servants. Every single morning and every single evening, without fail, these unlikely winged waiters arrived punctually at Elijah's riverside camp with his meals perfectly prepared. 1 Kings 17:6 confirms this daily miracle that continued month after month. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Picture this incredible scene in your mind while all of Israel began to feel the harsh effects of the drought that Elijah had proclaimed. God's faithful prophet was living peacefully and safely by a flowing stream, fed twice daily by a supernatural catering service that never missed a delivery. The ravens didn't forget even once. They came faithfully every morning and every evening, carrying fresh bread and meat in their strong beaks. Where did they get this food? The Bible doesn't say, but God had obviously made supernatural provision. Through this miracle, God was showing Elijah in the most practical way possible that he could provide abundantly through the most unexpected and unlikely means. If the Creator could command wild ravens to become faithful servants, there was absolutely nothing he couldn't do for those who trusted him completely. Month after long month, the drought continued exactly as Elijah had boldly proclaimed before King Ahab. The merciless sun beat down day after day on Israel's once fertile land. Crops withered and died in the fields. Wells that had provided water for generations went completely dry. Rivers became dusty creek beds. Animals grew weak and began to die from thirst and lack of food. The terrible famine spread relentlessly throughout the entire kingdom, affecting rich and poor, city dwellers and farmers alike. Even Elijah's safe haven by the brook Cherith wasn't completely immune to the effects of God's severe judgment. 1 Kings 17:7 records what eventually happened. And it happened after a while that the brook dried up, because there had been no rain in the land. The same devastating drought that was punishing Israel for their shameful idol worship had now finally reached even Elijah's remote hiding place. Day by day, the faithful prophet watched the water level steadily drop. The clear stream that had been his reliable lifeline for so many months was slowly but surely disappearing before his eyes. The rocks that had been covered with flowing water began to appear. The brook became a trickle, then just scattered pools, then completely dry. But this wasn't a mistake or an unfortunate oversight in God's perfect plan. It was precisely timed for the next chapter of Elijah's remarkable story. God's timing is always perfect, even when we can't understand it. When the brook finally ran completely dry and not even a drop remained, Elijah didn't panic or worry about where his next drink of water would come from. Through his months of miraculous provision by ravens and brook water, he had learned to trust God's perfect timing completely and without reservation. Just as the very last drops of water disappeared completely from the brook Cherith, leaving only dry stones and sand, God spoke to his faithful prophet again with new, surprising instructions for the next phase of his journey. 1 Kings 17:8-9 reveals God's unexpected next step. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." This divine command was absolutely shocking and surprising on multiple levels that must have amazed even Elijah. First, God was sending his prophet to Zarephath, a small coastal town in Sidon, which was none other than Queen Jezebel's own homeland. This was like sending him straight into the heart of enemy territory, to the very region where Baal worship had originated and was strongest. It would be the last place anyone would expect to find a Hebrew prophet hiding. Second, and equally surprising, God was directing him to depend on a widow for his provision and protection. In the ancient world, widows were typically among the poorest and most vulnerable people in society, usually depending on the charity and kindness of others for their basic survival, rather than having extra resources to share with strangers. How could a poor widow in a drought-stricken foreign land possibly provide for anyone else when she was probably struggling just to feed herself? But God's ways are always infinitely higher and wiser than human understanding or logic. He was about to demonstrate his unlimited power and faithful provision through the simple faith of a foreign woman, showing clearly that his love, care, and miraculous provision extend far beyond the borders of Israel to anyone, anywhere, who trusts in him with their whole heart. When Elijah arrived at the gates of Zarephath, tired and thirsty from his long journey, he saw exactly what God had promised, a widow gathering sticks. But she looked desperately poor, wearing the simple clothes of someone who had almost nothing left. Elijah called out to her with a simple request. 1 Kings 17:10 tells us what happened. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, indeed a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Please bring me a little water in a cup, that I may drink." The woman didn't refuse, but as she turned to get the water, Elijah made another request that must have shocked her. Verse 11 continues, "And as she was going to get it, he called to her and said, 'Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand.'" Her response revealed just how desperate her situation really was. In verse 12, she explained her heartbreaking reality. "So she said, 'As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die.'" She was preparing what she believed would be her final meal for herself and her son. After that, they expected to starve to death. But Elijah had an incredible message from God. Verse 13-14 records his amazing promise. "And Elijah said to her, 'Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth.'" The woman had a choice: trust this stranger's God or prepare for death. She chose faith. Verse 15-16 reveals what happened next. "So she went away and did according to the word of Elijah. And she and he and her household ate for many days. The bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Elijah. Every day she would scoop flour from the bin, expecting it to be empty, but there was always enough. Every day she would pour oil from the jar, certain it would run out, but it never did. God had turned her final meal into an endless supply that fed 3 people for months. Life in the widow's house had settled into a peaceful routine. Every day brought the miracle of never-ending flour and oil, and Elijah had become like family to them. But then tragedy struck without warning. The widow's son, the light of her life and her only child, became sick. Day by day, his condition grew worse, until finally the worst possible thing happened. 1 Kings 17-17 describes this heartbreaking moment. "Now it happened, after these things, that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, and his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. The boy was dead." Can you imagine the widow's pain and confusion? God had miraculously provided food for them every single day, so why would he allow her precious son to die? In her grief and anger, she turned on Elijah with words that cut deep. Verse 18 records her anguished cry. "So she said to Elijah, 'What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?'" She believed that somehow Elijah's presence had brought God's attention to her sins, and now her son was dead as punishment. The joy and trust they had built over months of miraculous provision was shattered in an instant. But Elijah didn't argue with her or try to explain. Instead, he acted with gentle compassion. Verse 19 tells us, "And he said to her, 'Give me your son.' So he took him out of her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his own bed. Elijah took the lifeless body of the boy upstairs to his own room, away from the mother's agonizing cries. There, alone with the dead child, Elijah poured out his own confused and desperate heart to God. In the quiet of the upper room, Elijah faced his own crisis of faith. He had seen God provide food miraculously every day, but now this innocent child was dead. Why would God allow such a thing? But instead of giving up, Elijah did what he knew best. He prayed with everything he had. 1 Kings 17:20 shows us his honest, desperate prayer. Then he cried out to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge by killing her son?" You see, Elijah wasn't afraid to question God or express his confusion. He laid the child on his own bed and then did something that had never been recorded in all of human history before this moment. Verse 21 describes his dramatic action. "And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times, and cried out to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." 3 times Elijah stretched his full body over the dead boy, pleading with God to restore his life. This wasn't a quiet, polite prayer. This was desperate, passionate intercession for a miracle that seemed impossible. And then the impossible happened. Verse 22 records the first resurrection in Scripture. "Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived." The boy's eyes opened. His chest began to rise and fall with breath. Life returned to his little body through the power of the God of Israel. Elijah's joy must have been overwhelming as he picked up the living child and carried him downstairs to his mother. Verse 23 captures this moment of pure joy. "And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, 'See, your son lives.'" The widow's response shows how this miracle changed everything she believed about God and his prophet. Verse 24 records her declaration. "Then the woman said to Elijah, 'Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth.'" Through this resurrection, the first ever recorded, God had proven his power over death itself. For 3 long years, the drought continued exactly as Elijah had proclaimed. The land of Israel suffered terribly. Crops failed, animals died, and people began to starve. King Ahab had searched everywhere for the prophet who had brought this judgment upon his kingdom, but Elijah had remained safely hidden, first at the brook Cherith, and then in Zarephath. But now God's timing was perfect for the next phase of his plan. 1 Kings 18:1 tells us when God decided to end the drought, "And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, 'Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth.'" After 3 years of hiding, God commanded Elijah to show himself to the very king who wanted him dead. This took incredible courage, but Elijah obeyed immediately. The famine had become so severe that even the royal palace was affected. Verse 2 explains, "So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab, and there was a severe famine in Samaria. King Ahab had sent his palace manager Obadiah to search for grass to keep the royal horses and mules alive. But Obadiah was secretly a believer who had hidden 100 prophets of God when Jezebel was trying to kill them all. When Obadiah met Elijah on the road, he could hardly believe his eyes. Verses 7 to 8 describe their encounter. "Now as Obadiah was on his way, suddenly Elijah met him, and he recognized him and fell on his face and said, 'Is that you, my lord Elijah?' And he answered him, 'It is I. Go, tell your master Elijah is here.'" Obadiah was terrified that if he told Ahab where Elijah was, the prophet might disappear again, and Ahab would kill the messenger. But Elijah assured him that he would not hide this time. When Ahab finally came face to face with the prophet who had caused 3 years of suffering, his greeting was full of anger and blame. Verse 17 records the king's accusation. "Then it happened, when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said to him, 'Is that you, O troubler of Israel?' But Elijah fearlessly turned the blame back where it belonged. Verse 18 shows his bold response, "And he answered, 'I have not troubled Israel. But you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals." Now that Elijah had confronted King Ahab directly, it was time for the ultimate test between the true God and the false god Baal. Elijah proposed a public contest that would settle the question once and for all. 1 Kings 18:19 records his dramatic challenge. "Now, therefore, send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." This wasn't going to be a private religious debate. Elijah wanted all of Israel to witness this showdown. Mount Carmel was the perfect location, a high mountain where everyone could see what happened. When the people gathered, Elijah addressed them with words that cut straight to the heart of their spiritual confusion. Verse 21 captures his powerful challenge. "And Elijah came to all the people and said, 'How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him.' But the people answered him not a word." The people had been trying to worship both God and Baal, but Elijah made it clear that this was impossible. They had to choose one or the other. Then Elijah explained the rules of the contest that would prove which God was real. Verses 23 to 24 outline his proposal. "Therefore let them give us 2 bulls, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves. Cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. Then you call on the name of your gods, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." The test was simple and fair. Both sides would prepare a sacrifice, but neither would light the fire. The God who sent fire from heaven to burn up the offering would prove himself to be the true God. The people loved this idea because it would settle the matter once and for all. Verse 24 confirms their agreement. "So all the people answered and said, 'It is well spoken.'" Since there were 450 prophets of Baal and only 1 prophet of the true God, Elijah graciously let them go first. The 450 prophets of Baal prepared their sacrifice carefully and began calling on their God with confidence. They were sure that Baal, who supposedly controlled lightning and storms, would easily send fire to consume their offering. 1 Kings 18:26 describes their morning efforts. "So they took the bull, which was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning even till noon, saying, 'O Baal, hear us.' But there was no voice. No one answered. Then they leaped about the altar which they had made. Hour after hour they cried out to Baal, but nothing happened. No fire came down, no voice answered, no sign appeared. Their dancing around the altar became more frantic as time passed. By noon, Elijah decided to add some pressure with his sharp sense of humor. Verse 27 records his mocking suggestions. "And so it was, at noon, that Elijah mocked them and said, 'Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey. Or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened.'" Elijah was basically saying that maybe Baal was too busy to answer. Or perhaps he was taking a nap and needed to be woken up. This drove the false prophets to even more desperate measures. Verse 28 describes their extreme actions. "So they cried aloud and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances, until the blood gushed out on them. They slashed their own bodies with sharp weapons, believing that their blood and pain would get Baal's attention. All afternoon, they continued this terrible display, becoming more and more frantic. Verse 29 tells us how long this went on. "And when midday was past, they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. From morning until evening, nearly 12 hours, they had cried, danced, cut themselves, and begged their God to answer. But Baal remained completely silent because Baal was not real. The altar sat cold and empty. The sacrifice remained unburned. And the 450 prophets had proven that their God was powerless. As evening approached and the prophets of Baal finally gave up in exhaustion and defeat, it was Elijah's turn to call on his God. But first, he had work to do. The old altar of the Lord on Mount Carmel had been broken down during the years of Baal worship, so Elijah needed to rebuild it properly. 1 Kings 18:30 tells us how he began. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." So all the people came near to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. Elijah didn't just throw together a quick altar. He built it according to God's instructions with deep symbolic meaning. Verse 31 explains his careful method. And Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel shall be your name." Each stone represented one of the 12 tribes of Israel, showing that this God belonged to all of Israel, not just one part. Verse 32 describes his thorough preparation. Then, with the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. The trench around the altar would play an important role in what was about to happen. Next, Elijah arranged the wood and placed the cut-up bull on top, just as the prophets of Baal had done. But then he did something that seemed to make his task impossible. Verse 33 records his surprising command, and he put the wood in order, cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood, and said, "Fill 4 water pots with water and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood." Water on a sacrifice that was supposed to catch fire. This seemed crazy, but Elijah wasn't done yet. Verse 34 shows how thoroughly he soaked everything. Then he said, "Do it a second time," and they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time," and they did it a third time. 3 times they poured water over the sacrifice and wood until everything was completely soaked. Verse 35 tells us the result. So the water ran all around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. The altar was drowning in water, making it humanly impossible for any fire to start. But Elijah served a God who specializes in impossible things. With the altar properly prepared and thoroughly soaked with water, Elijah stepped forward to pray. This wasn't like the frantic shouting and dancing of Baal's prophets. This was a calm, confident prayer to the God who actually existed. 1 Kings 18:36-37 records Elijah's simple but powerful prayer. And it came to pass, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that Elijah the prophet came near and said, "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again." Elijah's prayer was short, respectful, and focused on God's glory rather than his own reputation. He wanted everyone to know that the true God of Israel was still alive and powerful. The response was immediate and spectacular. Verse 38 describes what happened next. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. This wasn't just a small flame that lit the sacrifice. This was a blast of fire so powerful that it consumed everything. The meat, the wood, the 12 stones of the altar, even the dust around it, and all the water in the trench. Nothing was left but a clean, burned spot on the mountain. The people's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Verse 39 captures their response. Now when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces. And they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." After watching Baal's prophets fail for 12 hours, they had seen the true God answer in seconds, with power beyond imagination. The contest was over. The question was settled, and the people knew without any doubt which God was real. There was no more confusion, no more trying to worship both God and Baal. The fire from heaven had proven once and for all that the Lord alone is God. After the dramatic fire from heaven had proven God's power beyond any doubt, Elijah knew exactly what needed to happen next. The 450 false prophets of Baal who had led Israel into idolatry could not be allowed to escape and continue their deception. With the people now convinced that the Lord alone was God, Elijah acted swiftly. and decisively. 1 Kings 18:40 records his immediate command, and Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." So they seized them. And Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there. The brook Kishon was a stream that flowed down from Mount Carmel toward the Mediterranean Sea, winding through the valley below the mountain where this great contest had taken place. This wasn't a decision Elijah made in anger or revenge. It was divine judgment that God had commanded through the law of Moses centuries earlier. These false prophets had led an entire nation away from the true God and into the worship of demons disguised as fertility gods. They had corrupted Israel's children, taught lies about the nature of God, and caused countless people to sin against their Creator through immoral religious practices. The people, still amazed and shaken by the incredible fire they had just witnessed consuming the sacrifice, obeyed Elijah's command without question or hesitation. They seized all 450 prophets who just hours before had been cutting themselves with knives and crying desperately to their silent, powerless God. These men, who had lived in luxury at Queen Jezebel's table, enjoying royal protection and popular support, now found themselves prisoners of the very people they had deceived for so long. One by one, these deceivers who had poisoned Israel's faith with lies and led families into spiritual darkness were brought down to the brook and executed according to God's righteous law. The water of the Kishon ran red that day, as divine justice was finally carried out after years of patient endurance. This wasn't cruelty or unnecessary violence. It was the necessary spiritual cleansing that God required before he would send rain again upon the land. The spiritual cancer that had infected Israel for so many years was finally being cut out completely and permanently. Not one of the false prophets escaped to continue their evil work in some other place. The land was being purified from the contamination of false worship, and the way was being prepared for God's blessing to return to his covenant people. When the last false prophet was dead and their deceptive voices were silenced forever, the great spiritual battle was finally over. Baal's representatives in Israel had been completely defeated, and the true God had proven his absolute supremacy over all false gods and their servants. With the false prophets eliminated and God's honor fully restored before all the people, it was time for the devastating drought to end exactly as God had promised. Elijah climbed back up Mount Carmel with his faithful servant to pray earnestly for the rain that would heal the parched land and restore life to Israel. 1 Kings 18:41 shows how completely confident Elijah was in God's unchanging promise. Then Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of abundance of rain." Even though the sky above them was still completely clear, without a single cloud anywhere on the horizon, Elijah could already hear the rain coming in his spirit because God had promised it would come. He told King Ahab to go and celebrate with food and drink because the long drought was about to end dramatically. But Elijah himself went to the very top of the mountain to pray with intense focus and determination. Verse 42 describes his humble position of earnest intercession. So Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Carmel. Then he bowed down on the ground and put his face between his knees. This was the posture of someone praying with complete concentration and desperate earnestness, shutting out all distractions to focus entirely on seeking God's face. Elijah wasn't casually asking for rain as if it were a small favor. He was earnestly pleading with God for the fulfillment of his promise to end the judgment and restore blessing. Then Elijah sent his servant to look toward the western sea while he continued praying with unwavering persistence. Verse 43 tells us what happened during this time of patient waiting, and said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." So he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." And 7 times he said, "Go again." 6 times the faithful servant climbed up to the highest point to look carefully at the horizon over the Mediterranean Sea. And 6 times he returned with the disappointing report of seeing nothing but clear blue sky stretching endlessly to the horizon. But Elijah kept praying fervently and kept sending him back to look again. He knew God's promise was absolutely true and reliable, even when he couldn't see any physical evidence yet of its fulfillment. His faith wasn't based on what his eyes could see, but on what God had spoken. Finally, on the 7th time, something small but significant appeared. Verse 44 records the breakthrough moment that changed everything. Then it came to pass the 7th time that he said, "There is a cloud, as small as a man's hand, rising out of the sea." So he said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot, and go down before the rain stops you." After 3.5 years of perfectly clear skies, day after day, a tiny cloud finally appeared on the distant horizon. It was no bigger than a person's hand when held up against the sky. But Elijah knew with absolute certainty that this was the beginning of God's powerful answer to his prayer. He immediately sent urgent word to King Ahab to hurry home to his palace, before the coming storm would make travel impossible on the muddy roads. The news of what had happened on Mount Carmel reached Queen Jezebel very quickly through her network of spies and informants, and her reaction was exactly what you might expect from someone whose entire religious system had just been publicly destroyed and humiliated. When she heard the detailed report that the fire of God had consumed the sacrifice, while her prophets had failed completely, and that all 450 of her carefully chosen prophets had been killed at the brook Kishon, she was filled with murderous rage and an uncontrollable desire for revenge. The very next morning after this great victory for God's truth, Jezebel sent a threatening message to Elijah that would change everything and send the victorious prophet into the darkest period of his entire life. 1 Kings 19:1-2 records her deadly promise. And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying this, "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow, about this time." Jezebel was making a solemn oath, swearing by her false gods that within exactly 24 hours, Elijah would be dead, just like every one of her prophets who had died at the brook. This wasn't an empty threat made in the heat of anger. Jezebel had the political power, the financial resources, and the ruthless determination to carry out her promise of death. She had already successfully killed many of God's prophets before this time, systematically hunting them down and eliminating them from Israel. And she would not hesitate for a moment to kill the one who had publicly humiliated her and destroyed her religious influence forever. When Elijah received this chilling message from the queen's personal messenger, something completely unexpected happened that shows how human even great prophets can be. The same man who had fearlessly confronted King Ahab in his own palace, challenged 450 false prophets before thousands of witnesses, and confidently called down fire from heaven, suddenly became overwhelmed with fear and panic. Verse 3 shows his shocking response. And when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. The great prophet who had shown such incredible courage and faith just one day before was now running desperately for his life like a hunted criminal. He traveled all the way south to Beersheba, which was at the very southern border of Judah, as far from Jezebel's murderous reach as he could get, while still remaining within the territory of God's people. There he made the difficult decision to leave his faithful servant behind, perhaps to protect the young man from whatever terrible fate might be waiting ahead, or perhaps because he wanted to face his fears and despair completely alone. From Beersheba, Elijah continued his desperate flight alone into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the Negev desert, leaving behind the last traces of civilization and human comfort. He was no longer thinking clearly or rationally about his situation. He was a man running blindly from his overwhelming fears and drowning in complete emotional and spiritual exhaustion. After walking for an entire day deeper into the barren desert where no one could possibly find him or follow him, he finally collapsed in utter exhaustion under a small, scraggly broom tree, the only tiny bit of shade he could find in that desolate, sun-baked wasteland. 1 Kings 19:4 captures the devastating depth of his despair and hopelessness. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die and said, "It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." This was the same man who had just witnessed and participated in the most amazing display of God's power that had been seen in generations. Yet now he was begging God to end his life because he couldn't bear to continue living. Elijah felt like a complete and total failure in every way that mattered. He had hoped desperately that the incredible victory on Mount Carmel would turn the whole nation back to God permanently and end the spiritual war once and for all. But Jezebel's immediate threat showed him clearly that the battle was far from over and that evil still had tremendous power. One wicked woman's threatening message had completely undone all his confidence and left him feeling utterly hopeless, defeated, and worthless. He was physically exhausted from his long journey through difficult terrain, emotionally drained from the intense spiritual confrontation with Baal's prophets, and spiritually discouraged by the painful realization that his great victory hadn't changed everything he had hoped and prayed it would change. In his deep depression, Elijah couldn't see past his immediate circumstances to remember God's faithfulness in the past or his promises for the future. He felt completely alone in the world, abandoned by God and man, and worthless as a servant of the Most High. The great prophet who had been used so mightily by God now lay under a scraggly desert bush, earnestly asking God to end his life because he couldn't bear the emotional and spiritual burden anymore. He was convinced that he had failed completely in his mission and that he was no better than the previous generations of God's servants who had also struggled against evil and died without seeing the complete victory they had longed for. But God didn't abandon his discouraged and exhausted servant alone in the wilderness to die of despair and dehydration. While Elijah slept the deep sleep of complete physical and emotional exhaustion under the sparse shade of the broom tree, God sent supernatural help in the form of an angel with a special mission of mercy and restoration. 1 Kings 19:5 tells us what happened during this divine intervention. As he lay and slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." The touch was gentle but firm, and the voice was kind but urgent, waking the prophet from his exhausted slumber with words of care rather than rebuke. When Elijah opened his weary eyes, he found that God had provided exactly what he needed most in his current condition. Verse 6 describes the miraculous provision that appeared beside him. Then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. The angel had prepared fresh bread that was still warm from baking on hot coals, and cool, refreshing water in a jar for the desperately thirsty prophet. This wasn't just ordinary food that might be found in the desert. It was heaven's special provision, prepared specifically for God's beloved but struggling servant. The bread was perfectly baked, nourishing and satisfying, and the water was pure and refreshing to his parched throat. Elijah ate and drank gratefully, his body beginning to recover from the dehydration and hunger, then went back to sleep, still emotionally and spiritually exhausted from his ordeal and not yet ready to face his future. But the angel's ministry wasn't finished after this first meal. Verse 7 shows the angel's continued, patient care. And the angel of the Lord came back the second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." The angel knew something important that Elijah didn't yet understand. He was about to embark on a long, difficult journey that would require supernatural physical strength and endurance beyond normal human capacity. The food God was providing wasn't just for his immediate hunger and thirst, but for the extended trip that lay ahead of him. Verse 8 reveals the absolutely amazing power of this heavenly meal. So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. 40 days and 40 nights without eating again. This was the same significant length of time that Moses had spent on Mount Sinai, receiving the law from God, and the same period that Jesus would later fast in the wilderness before beginning his public ministry. The food that the angel prepared and served gave Elijah supernatural strength and endurance to travel for more than a month without needing to eat again. For 40 days and 40 nights, Elijah traveled steadily through the harsh wilderness, sustained only by the supernatural food the angel had provided in his time of desperate need. His destination was Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, the same sacred mountain where God had given Moses the 10 Commandments and revealed his glory to the people of Israel hundreds of years earlier. This was one of the most holy and significant places on earth, where God had repeatedly revealed himself to his people in dramatic and life-changing ways throughout their history. 1 Kings 19:8 tells us about his arrival at this sacred destination. So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. When Elijah finally reached this towering, imposing mountain after his long journey, he was drawn by instinct to a specific place that would provide both shelter from the elements and the solitude he needed for whatever God had planned. Verse 9 describes where he went and what happened there. And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God's question wasn't asked because he didn't know where Elijah was or why he had come to this remote place. God knows everything about our circumstances and our hearts before we ever speak. This was a gentle, loving way of getting Elijah to examine his own heart and motives carefully and honestly. Why had he really run away from his calling and responsibility? What was he truly seeking by coming to this isolated mountain so far from his homeland? God wanted his discouraged and confused prophet to think carefully and deeply about his situation, his feelings, his fears, and his relationship with his Creator. The cave where Elijah took shelter and spent the night may very well have been the same cleft in the rock where God had hidden Moses when his glory passed by in all its terrible and wonderful splendor. This mountain was a place where God had always met with his chosen servants in times of crisis, transition, and spiritual renewal throughout the centuries. Abraham had been willing to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac on this mountain in obedience to God's command. Moses had received the law here and had seen God's glory in ways that transformed him forever. Now Elijah, feeling like a complete failure and ready to give up entirely on his calling, had come to this same holy place seeking answers, comfort, and perhaps a new understanding of his purpose. The mountain of God was about to become the place where Elijah's shattered faith would be renewed, and his understanding of God's character would be deepened in ways he never expected when God gently asked Elijah what he was doing at Mount Horeb. The discouraged prophet poured out his heart with complete honesty about his deep discouragement, overwhelming fear, and sense of total failure. 1 Kings 19:10 records his detailed complaint. So he said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life also." Elijah felt completely alone and abandoned in his service to God, believing he was the only faithful person left in all of Israel who still truly worshipped the Lord. He believed that everyone else had turned away from God, that all the other prophets had been murdered, and that now even he was being hunted like a dangerous criminal who deserved to die. God's response was to give Elijah a profound lesson about his true nature and character that would completely change the prophet's understanding forever. Verse 11 records God's specific instruction. Then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. The wind was incredibly powerful and destructive, strong enough to literally shatter solid rocks on the mountainside into pieces, displaying the kind of raw, overwhelming force that could destroy anything in its path. But God was not revealed or present in this impressive display of natural power. This must have surprised Elijah greatly, since he had recently seen God work through dramatic displays of supernatural power like the consuming fire on Mount Carmel that had amazed everyone who witnessed it. But there was much more to come in this divine lesson. Verse 11 continues with the next demonstration, "And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake." The ground shook violently beneath Elijah's feet with tremendous force, the kind of earthquake that could level cities and change the landscape permanently. This was another display of awesome power that demanded attention and inspired fear. But again, God was not manifesting himself through this impressive natural phenomenon. Then came something even more familiar and meaningful to Elijah's recent experience with God's power. Verse 12 tells us, "And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire." Fire. Just a few days before, Elijah had seen God send fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice on Mount Carmel in front of thousands of witnesses. Surely God would reveal himself through fire again, since this had been such a powerful demonstration of his presence and power so recently. But no, even though fire appeared on the mountain, God was not in the fire this time either. Each of these three powerful displays, the rock-shattering wind, the ground-shaking earthquake, and the consuming fire, represented exactly the kind of dramatic, overwhelming power that Elijah had become accustomed to seeing in God's mighty works. But God was patiently teaching him that his presence and his methods of working are not limited to spectacular demonstrations of force that demand attention through their very magnitude. After the wind, earthquake and fire had passed, leaving the mountain quiet and still. Something completely different happened that would forever change how Elijah understood God's character and the ways he chooses to work in the world. 1 Kings 19:12 describes this gentle, intimate moment, "And after the fire a still small voice." Other translations describe this as a gentle whisper, a soft murmur, or a sound of gentle stillness that was almost too quiet to hear. This wasn't the booming thunder that had accompanied God's fearsome presence on this same mountain when he gave Moses the law amid lightning and smoke. This wasn't the roaring fire that had dramatically consumed the sacrifice on Mount Carmel before thousands of amazed witnesses. This was something quiet, gentle, and deeply personal, the soft, tender whisper of God speaking intimately and lovingly to his beloved but wounded servant. Elijah's immediate response shows that he recognized this gentle voice as the true, authentic presence of God more clearly than all the dramatic displays that had come before. Verse 13 tells us, "So it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' Elijah quickly covered his face with his cloak out of deep reverence and holy fear, then stepped humbly to the mouth of the cave to meet personally with God. The question was exactly the same one God had asked before, but now it came in the context of this gentle, personal encounter that spoke of love rather than judgment. God wasn't angry with Elijah for running away in fear or disappointed in his very human moment of weakness and discouragement. He was simply inviting his faithful servant to share openly and honestly what was really in his heart, his fears, his doubts, and his confusion. Elijah gave the same completely honest answer as before, repeating his deep feelings of loneliness, discouragement, and failure. But now God began to show him a different, more accurate perspective on his situation and his continuing calling as a prophet. Through this still, small voice, God was gently teaching Elijah that his most powerful and lasting work often happens not through dramatic public displays that capture everyone's attention, but through quiet personal moments of relationship and intimate communication between him and his servants. The same God who could send consuming fire from heaven and split solid rocks with hurricane-force wind could also speak in whispers that touch the human heart more deeply and permanently than any earthquake or lightning. This gentle voice would soon give Elijah new instructions for his ministry, new hope for his future, and a completely new understanding of how God works in the world through faithful people who learn to listen carefully for his quiet guidance, rather than always expecting thunder and lightning to announce his presence. Through the gentle whisper at Mount Horeb, God began to reveal his continuing plan for Israel and Elijah's role in carrying it out. The discouraged prophet learned that his work wasn't finished and that God had specific tasks for him to complete before his ministry would end. 1 Kings 19:15-16 records God's detailed commission. Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi as king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place." God was giving Elijah 3 important assignments that would shape the future of the entire region. First, he was to anoint Hazael as the future king of Syria, Israel's neighboring enemy nation. This seemed strange, but God had plans to use even foreign kings to accomplish his purposes. Second, he was to anoint Jehu as the future king of Israel, replacing the wicked dynasty of Ahab and Jezebel. Third, and most personally significant, he was to anoint Elisha as his own replacement, the prophet who would continue God's work when Elijah's time was over. God then explained how these 3 men would work together to complete his judgment on Israel's wickedness. Verse 17 reveals the divine strategy. "It shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill." This wasn't about random violence, but about God's righteous judgment being carried out through different instruments. Those who escaped judgment from one source would face it from another until justice was complete. But God also gave Elijah encouraging news that answered his complaint about being alone. Verse 18 contains God's surprising revelation. "Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Elijah wasn't alone at all. God had kept 7,000 faithful people in Israel who had never worshipped Baal or participated in the idolatrous practices. These were people who had remained true to God, even during the darkest times, though they had stayed hidden and quiet about their faith. This knowledge must have been incredibly encouraging to Elijah, showing him that God's work was much bigger than what he could see, and that faithful people existed throughout the land, even when they weren't visible or vocal about their beliefs. Armed with his new commission from God, Elijah left Mount Horeb and began the journey back toward Israel to carry out his assignments. The first task he accomplished was finding and calling Elisha, the man who would eventually take his place as God's prophet. 1 Kings 19:19 tells us how this momentous meeting took place. "So he departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him. Elisha was working in the fields, plowing with a team of 24 oxen arranged in 12 pairs, a sign that his family was wealthy and owned significant land. He was personally working with the 12th and final pair, showing that he wasn't afraid of hard physical labor despite his family's prosperity. When Elijah found him, the old prophet didn't give a long speech or explain everything about the calling. Instead, he simply threw his prophet's mantle over Elisha's shoulders, a symbolic act that immediately communicated what was happening. The mantle represented the prophet's authority and calling, and by placing it on Elisha, Elijah was marking him as his chosen successor. Elisha understood the significance immediately and responded with natural human concern for his family responsibilities. Verse 20 records his request, "And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, 'Please let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you.' And he said to him, 'Go back again, for what have I done to you?'" Elisha wanted to say goodbye to his parents before leaving his old life behind forever. Elijah's response showed that this calling was a choice, not a forced command. He was essentially saying, "Think about what this means and decide for yourself." Elisha made his decision quickly and decisively. Verse 21 describes his dramatic farewell. "So Elisha turned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slaughtered them and boiled their flesh, using the oxen's equipment as fuel, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah and became his servant. Elisha killed his oxen and burned his plowing equipment to cook the meat, then fed the entire community. This wasn't just a meal. It was a public declaration that he was leaving his old life permanently and completely. By destroying his farming tools, he was making it impossible to return to his previous occupation. There would be no going back. Then he followed Elijah and became his servant, beginning his training for the prophetic ministry that would define the rest of his life. After Elisha left his family's farm to follow Elijah, the two prophets began a period of close companionship and intensive training that would last for several years. During this time, Elijah taught Elisha not just about the techniques of prophecy, but about the character and ways of God, the responsibilities of spiritual leadership, and the challenges of speaking God's truth in a hostile world. The Bible doesn't give us many details about these years of mentorship, but it's clear that Elisha learned not only from Elijah's words, but from watching his life and ministry up close. They traveled together throughout Israel, visiting the schools of prophets that existed in various cities, ministering to people's needs, and confronting the continuing problems of idolatry and injustice in the land. During this period, Elijah continued his prophetic ministry with renewed purpose and energy. He was no longer the discouraged man who had fled into the wilderness, but a prophet restored to confidence in God's plan and his own calling. Elisha served him faithfully, learning through experience what it meant to be God's spokesman in difficult times. The older prophet shared his wisdom about hearing God's voice, understanding his character, and maintaining faith when circumstances seemed impossible. Elisha also learned about the loneliness that often comes with prophetic ministry, the courage required to speak unpopular truths, and the supernatural power that God provides for those who trust him completely. Throughout these years, their relationship deepened from master and servant to something more like father and son. Elisha developed a deep love and respect for his mentor, while Elijah came to trust and depend on his faithful companion. They faced dangers together, witnessed miracles together, and shared the unique burden that comes with being responsible for delivering God's messages to a rebellious people. This wasn't just professional training. It was the formation of a spiritual father-son relationship that would culminate in one of the most dramatic transitions in biblical history. As the years passed, both men knew that their time together was limited and that God was preparing Elisha to carry on the prophetic ministry alone. The training was thorough and the bond was strong, laying the foundation for what would happen when the time came for their final journey together. The day finally came when God revealed to Elijah that his earthly ministry was about to end in the most extraordinary way imaginable. Instead of dying a natural death like other men, he would be taken up alive into heaven. This knowledge was somehow communicated not only to Elijah, but also to the groups of prophets who lived in various cities throughout Israel. 2 Kings 2:1 sets the scene for this remarkable day. And it came to pass, when the Lord was about to take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. The journey began in Gilgal, a place that held special significance in Israel's history as the first camp after crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. From there, Elijah planned to visit several locations before his final departure, and Elisha was determined to accompany him every step of the way. Their first destination was Bethel, where a school of prophets was located. As they prepared to leave Gilgal, Elijah tried to convince Elisha to stay behind. Verse 2 records his attempt. Then Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." And so they went down to Bethel. Elijah may have been trying to spare Elisha the pain of watching his departure, or perhaps he wanted to test his commitment one final time. But Elisha was absolutely determined not to be separated from his master, especially on this crucial day. When they arrived in Bethel, the local prophets immediately approached Elisha with a question that revealed their supernatural knowledge of what was about to happen. Verse 3 tells us, "Now the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, 'Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?' And he said, 'Yes, I know. Keep silent.'" These young prophets had received revelation about Elijah's coming departure, but their question was painful for Elisha to hear. He knew what was going to happen, but he didn't want to discuss it or think about losing the man who had become like a father to him. His response to keep silent showed both his knowledge of the situation and his emotional struggle with the reality of what was coming. The word was spreading among the prophetic communities that this was no ordinary day, but the day when one of Israel's greatest prophets would leave the earth in a way that had never happened before. From Bethel, Elijah and Elisha continued their journey to Jericho, where another group of prophets lived and ministered. Once again, Elijah tried to convince Elisha to remain behind, and once again, Elisha refused to be separated from his master. 2 Kings 2:4-5 records this second attempt and the prophet's reaction. Then Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. Now the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho came to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?" So he answered, "Yes, I know, keep silent." The same scene repeated itself. The local prophets had received the same revelation about Elijah's departure, and Elisha gave the same response, acknowledging his knowledge but asking them not to talk about it. The pain was too great for him to discuss openly. From Jericho, their final destination was the Jordan River, the same river that had been miraculously parted for Joshua and the Israelites when they first entered the Promised Land centuries earlier. When they reached the riverbank, 50 of the young prophets from Jericho followed them to watch what would happen. Verse 6-7 describes their arrival. Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on, and 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood facing them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. For the third time, Elijah tried to leave Elisha behind, and for the third time Elisha refused. The 50 prophets positioned themselves where they could witness whatever was about to happen, maintaining a respectful distance, but ensuring they could see this historic moment. Then Elijah performed a miracle that echoed the great works of Moses and Joshua. Verse 8 records this amazing event. Now Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water, and it was divided this way and that, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. Just as Moses had stretched out his rod to part the Red Sea and Joshua had led the priests with the ark to part the Jordan, now Elijah struck the water with his prophet's mantle, and the river divided before them. The waters rolled back on both sides, creating a dry path across the riverbed. This miracle demonstrated that the same God who had worked through Moses and Joshua was still working through his prophets, and that Elijah carried the same divine authority that had been given to Israel's greatest leaders. The 50 watching prophets witnessed this incredible display of God's power, confirming that they were indeed watching the departure of a man who had walked closely with the Almighty throughout his ministry. Once they had crossed the Jordan River, on dry ground, Elijah and Elisha found themselves alone on the other side, away from the watching eyes of the 50 prophets. It was here, in this private moment, that Elijah offered to grant Elisha one final request before his departure from the earth. 2 Kings 2:9 records this touching conversation. And so it was, when they had crossed over, that Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask, what may I do for you before I am taken away from you?" Elisha said, "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." This was an extraordinary request that revealed the depth of Elisha's understanding of his calling and his complete dedication to continuing Elijah's work. He wasn't asking for wealth, fame, or personal comfort. He was asking for spiritual power, specifically a double portion of the same spirit that had enabled Elijah to perform miracles, speak God's words with authority, and stand courageously against the forces of evil. In the culture of that time, the firstborn son received a double portion of his father's inheritance, twice as much as any other son. By asking for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, Elisha was essentially asking to be treated as Elijah's spiritual firstborn, his primary heir in the prophetic ministry. He understood that the challenges facing Israel were enormous and that he would need supernatural power beyond what any normal person possessed. Elijah's response showed both the significance of the request and the conditions that would determine whether it could be granted. Verse 10 records his reply. So he said, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you, but if not, it shall not be so." Elijah couldn't grant this request by his own power. It was something that only God could give. But he could tell Elisha what the sign would be, that God had honored his request. If Elisha was able to see Elijah's actual departure into heaven, it would indicate that God had granted him the spiritual sight and sensitivity necessary to receive the double portion he had requested. This wasn't just about physical eyesight, but about spiritual perception and readiness to receive the mantle of prophetic authority. The test would reveal whether Elisha had developed the spiritual maturity and divine calling necessary to carry forward Elijah's ministry with even greater power than his master had demonstrated. As Elijah and Elisha walked and talked together, both men knowing that their time was running out, the most spectacular event in either of their lives was about to unfold before their eyes. 2 Kings 2:11 describes what happened next. Then it happened as they continued on and talked that suddenly a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Without any warning, the sky suddenly blazed with supernatural light as a chariot made entirely of fire appeared, drawn by horses that were also composed of living flame. This wasn't ordinary fire that burns and destroys, but heavenly fire that radiated the glory and power of God Himself. The appearance was so sudden and overwhelming that it immediately separated the two prophets, coming between them like a divine barrier. This chariot of fire was God's own royal transportation, sent specifically to carry His faithful servant home to heaven without experiencing death. The horses of fire that pulled this celestial vehicle were magnificent beyond description, creatures of pure spiritual energy that existed to serve the will of the Almighty. Elisha watched in amazement as this incredible sight filled his vision. confirming that he was indeed witnessing something that no other human being had ever seen before. The fire didn't harm Elijah. Instead, it surrounded him and lifted him up as the whirlwind took hold of him. This whirlwind wasn't a destructive tornado, but a controlled, divine wind that carried God's prophet up through the clouds and into the heavenly realm. As Elijah was caught up in this supernatural whirlwind, he didn't struggle or resist. He simply allowed God's power to transport him from the earthly realm into the eternal presence of his Creator. The sight was so overwhelming and emotionally powerful that Elisha could barely contain his reaction. He had passed the test that Elijah had described. He was indeed able to see his master's departure, which meant that God had granted his request for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. This moment marked the end of one of the most remarkable, lives in all of biblical history, and the beginning of an even more powerful prophetic ministry through Elisha, who had proven himself worthy to carry on the work that his beloved master was leaving behind. As the chariot of fire and horses of fire carried Elijah up into heaven in the whirlwind, Elisha cried out with words that revealed both his love for his master and his recognition of Elijah's importance to Israel's spiritual and military strength. 2 Kings 2:12 records his emotional response, and Elisha saw it, and he cried out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." So when he could see him no more, he took hold of his own clothes and tore them into 2 pieces. Elisha called Elijah my father, showing the deep father-son relationship that had developed between them over the years of training and companionship. But he also called him the chariot of Israel and its horsemen, recognizing that Elijah had been worth more to Israel's defense than an entire army of chariots and cavalry. One faithful prophet of God was more valuable for the nation's protection than all their military might, because God's power working through his servant was greater than any human force. When Elijah finally disappeared from sight, taken up completely into heaven, Elisha tore his own clothes in grief, following the ancient custom of mourning. But his grief was mixed with wonder at what he had witnessed and anticipation of what God would do through him in the days ahead. The proof that he had indeed received the double portion he had requested came immediately in the form of a physical sign. Verse 13 tells us what happened next. He also took up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. During Elijah's ascension, his prophet's mantle had fallen from him back to earth, landing where Elisha could retrieve it. This wasn't an accident. It was God's way of transferring the authority and calling from one prophet to the next. The mantle represented the prophetic office and the power that came with it. Now it belonged to Elisha, marking him as Elijah's official successor. To confirm that the power had indeed been transferred, Elisha immediately put the mantle to the test. Verse 14 describes his first miracle as the new prophet. Then he took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water and said, "Where is the Lord God of Elijah?" And when he also had struck the water, it was divided this way and that. And Elisha crossed over. Just as Elijah had parted the Jordan earlier that day, now Elisha used the same mantle to perform the same miracle. The waters divided before him, allowing him to cross back to where the 50 prophets were waiting and watching. This miracle proved beyond doubt that God's power now rested on Elisha, and that he was indeed Elijah's legitimate successor. When the young prophets saw him crossing the river on dry ground, they immediately recognized what had happened. Verse 15 records their response. Now, when the sons of the prophets who were from Jericho saw him at a distance, they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." And they came to meet him and bowed down to the ground before him. They acknowledged Elisha as their new leader, showing him the same respect they had shown to Elijah. If this story has touched your heart and strengthened your faith, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you won't miss any of our biblical stories. These ancient accounts aren't just history. They're living testimonies of God's power and love that can transform your life today. Please share this video with your family, friends, and anyone who needs to be reminded that our God is still the God of miracles. Your share might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. Together, let's spread these powerful stories of faith to every corner of the world. What story would you like to see next? Leave your suggestions in the comments below, and don't forget, the same God who took Elijah to heaven in a chariot of fire is watching over you right now.